Ethan was a young black man, born with a hand that was different from others, a hand that never fully developed, leaving him with a constant reminder of how the world saw him as incomplete. From a young age, he faced the harsh sting of prejudice, not only because of his skin color but also because of his physical imperfection. In a society obsessed with appearances, Ethan's differences made him an outcast. Every glance, every whisper, and every cold shoulder reinforced the belief that he didn't belong. Despite possessing a sharp intellect and a burning passion for journalism, he found doors closed to him at every turn. Each time he submitted an application to a newsroom, he was rejected, not just because of his skin color, but because his hand, his very being, was a constant reminder to others of the things they considered imperfect. But Ethan wasn't one to back down. The rejection only fueled his resolve. He could feel the weight of the world's judgment pressing down on him, but instead of folding under its pressure, he grew more determined. He knew that his voice could be a tool for change. He had the skills and the will to become a journalist, to expose the truth, and to fight for the stories that others ignored. Yet, with every rejection, his frustration grew, not just because of the closed doors but because of the invisible barriers that divided him from the opportunities he deserved. He could feel the world constantly telling him he was less than, that his dreams didn't matter because of how he looked. But deep down, he knew he wasn't defined by his appearance or the flaws others saw in him. He was defined by his actions, his words, and the fire that burned within him. Ethan had no intention of staying silent, no intention of letting society's narrow view of him dictate his future. He believed that his voice, no matter how small the world made him feel, had the power to create change. He was determined to prove that he was more than just the judgments others placed on him. He was someone who could challenge the system, someone who could tell the stories that needed to be heard. And despite everything that tried to hold him back, Ethan would keep pushing forward, unwilling to let society define his worth. One evening, as Ethan was walking home through the familiar, quiet streets of his neighborhood, something happened that would change everything. He heard shouting in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. His pulse quickened as he instinctively picked up his pace, his mind racing with questions and dread. Turning a corner, he saw them, a group of white men surrounding a lone black man, their fists raised as they pummeled him mercilessly. The words they spat were drenched in hate, racial slurs that cut through the night air like daggers. Ethan's stomach dropped, his breath caught in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen, the sight of the brutality stunning him into disbelief. But then, a rush of anger surged through him, overpowering the fear that had paralyzed him. The man on the ground, beaten and bloodied, looked up at him, his eyes pleading for help. That was all Ethan needed to snap into action. He fumbled with his phone, hands shaking from a mixture of adrenaline and fear. As he began recording, his heart hammered in his chest, each thump loud in his ears. He could hear the attackers yelling at him, telling him to get out of there, but he refused to stop. The sound of the blows landing, the victims' desperate cries for mercy, echoed in his ears. Ethan's palms were sweaty, his fingers gripping the phone tightly, but he kept filming. The anger in him was building, a storm of emotions he had never felt so intensely before. His own fear was eclipsed by the overwhelming need to capture the truth, to make sure this brutality wasn't hidden away, ignored by a system that had been complicit in these injustices for far too long. When the attackers finally scattered, leaving the victim motionless on the ground, Ethan hesitated only a moment before rushing to call the police. His voice was shaky as he described the assault, his words spilling out in a rush of panic and frustration. But when the officers arrived, their indifference was almost more painful than the assault itself. They barely looked at the victim, shrugging it off as just another gang-related incident. They didn't take statements, didn't seem to care about the racial motivations behind the attack. Their attitude was dismissive, as if this was just another day in a long line of unimportant events. Ethan's blood boiled. He could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. How could they ignore this? How could they turn a blind eye to the violence, to the hatred that was so clearly on display? His hands trembled as he walked away from the scene, but there was a fire inside him now, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't be passive, couldn't stay silent like so many others who had simply accepted the status quo. The apathy of the police, the lack of accountability, it was all too much to bear. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, unable to sleep. His mind raced as he replayed the events over and over. He knew the risks of what he was about to do, but in that moment, he didn't care. He had to speak out. The system had failed that man, had failed so many like him, and Ethan refused to be complicit in that failure. He poured his anger and frustration into his writing, detailing everything he had witnessed, the attack, the apathy, the fear, and the heartbreaking realization that this kind of violence was all too common, all too often ignored. The words flowed from him in a rush, each sentence more urgent than the last. When he finished, he hesitated for only a moment before posting the article online. He knew the dangers of doing this, knew that it could bring backlash, threats, and more isolation. But as he clicked publish, there was a sense of clarity that settled over him. He wasn't just telling a story about one attack, he was shedding light on a system that allowed this to happen again and again. He was giving a voice to those who had been silenced by fear and oppression. Ethan felt a mixture of dread and determination in his chest. He had opened a door he couldn't close, and there was no going back. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that could actually make a difference. The fear still lingered, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that he wasn't going to stay silent anymore. He had a voice, and he was going to use it. The following morning, Ethan woke up to an avalanche of notifications. His article had exploded online, rapidly gaining traction as people across the country shared it, commenting with outrage, and calling for justice. The sense of empowerment he felt at first soon began to fade as the hours dragged on. His phone buzzed constantly, the screen lighting up with message after message. At first, the responses were supportive, people thanking him for his bravery, offering their own stories of discrimination, and expressing their solidarity. It felt validating, as if the world was finally waking up to the truth that he had been screaming for so long. But as the day went on, a darker side of this newfound attention began to show itself. The threats came pouring in next. Anonymous messages flooded his inbox, some from strangers, others from people he had once considered allies. Some were harsh, others more sinister. "You're going to regret this," one read. "You have no idea who you're messing with," another one warned. The messages grew more direct as the day wore on, some with vague but chilling threats about what would happen if he didn't take down the post. But it wasn't just the anonymous messages that unnerved him. It was the ones from people he knew. Former classmates, friends, even family members reached out, urging him to back off. "This isn't your fight, Ethan. You're stirring up trouble for nothing," his cousin texted. "You're just making things worse," a colleague wrote. And then, the worst of all, "You don't want to be known for this. Take the post down, or we'll make sure you regret it." The weight of their words sank in, pressing down on him. Each notification, each new message, felt like a punch in the gut. Was this what he had wanted? To be hated? To risk everything for a story? The fear gnawed at him, making it hard to breathe. His heart raced with every new message, every phone call. He could feel his resolve starting to crack. What had he done? The fear was overwhelming, and for the first time, he found himself doubting his own decision. The people he loved were telling him to stop. The threats were real. How far were they willing to go to silence him? His phone rang. Ethan's stomach twisted as he saw the number on the screen, an unknown number, one he hadn't seen before. With shaking hands, he answered, holding his breath, unsure of what to expect. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "You've made a mistake," the voice said, smooth and chilling. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You've opened a door you can't close. This isn't your fight. Leave it alone, and maybe we'll forget about you. Keep pushing, and we'll make sure you understand the consequences." The call ended abruptly, the line going dead in his ear. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at his phone in shock, his breath shallow. The words echoed in his mind, the coldness of the voice sinking deep into his chest. Fear curled around him like a suffocating fog. What had he gotten himself into? Was he really ready for this? His heart thudded painfully in his chest as his hands began to shake. He felt small, insignificant, a tiny voice in a world so much bigger than him. The weight of it all felt unbearable, and for a moment, he thought about deleting the post, taking it all back. But then, something shifted inside him. He thought of the man lying on the ground, broken and bruised, left behind by the very system that was supposed to protect him. He thought of the countless other victims who had suffered in silence, their pain ignored by the authorities, their voices drowned out by the same systems that had kept him quiet for so long. Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had made his choice. This wasn't just about the article anymore. It was about everything he had felt, everything he had lived through. It was about the hate, the ignorance, and the refusal to see people for who they truly were. It was about the injustice that had festered for so long, and about finally having the courage to speak out against it. He could feel the weight of his decision, the pressure of the threats, the fear that threatened to undo him. But beneath it all, there was something stronger. A quiet defiance, a burning determination to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. With a steadying breath, Ethan put his phone down and stood tall, the uncertainty still gnawing at him but no longer controlling him. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not like this. He was doing what was right, and that meant more than any threat, any message, or any fear. It was time to stop doubting himself. Ethan wasn't just fighting for one story. He was fighting for truth, for the voices that had been silenced for too long, and for the change that needed to come. And as the weight of the threats continued to press in on him, he held on to that thought: no one could silence him, not anymore. Days passed, and the storm of backlash against Ethan only grew more intense, relentless in its pursuit. His inbox had become a toxic wellspring of hatred. Each new message that popped up on his screen felt like another punch in the gut, each one more vicious than the last. At first, it had been mostly anonymous threats, harmless, maybe, in some ways. But then, the faces he had once known, colleagues and friends, began to turn. They sent messages telling him to stop causing trouble, warning him that he was jeopardizing his career and social standing. Some were even more direct, using words that made it clear they believed he was threatening their way of life. "You don't know what you've done," one message read. "You're putting yourself on the wrong side of history." Others were more blunt: "You better take down the post or face the consequences." They were no longer just empty words, they were personal. With each passing day, the weight of it all began to crush him. Ethan had expected backlash, sure, but he hadn't prepared for the isolation it would bring. Everywhere he went, it felt like he was walking with a target on his back. People avoided his gaze, colleagues whispered as he passed by, and friends who had once stood by him now kept their distance. The constant buzz of his phone, the constant need to defend himself, wore him down. It was like he was being erased, piece by piece. The loneliness crept in, deep and suffocating. The fear became more than just a feeling, it was a living, breathing presence that never left him, even when he was alone. He had never felt so isolated in his life. Yet, somewhere in the depths of his despair, a quiet defiance began to stir within him. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, threatening to swallow him whole. But it no longer had the same power over him. He would not let it. He couldn't. Ethan knew, deep in his bones, that he had made the right choice, even if it had cost him. Even if it meant he had to face the wrath of the world, he would not back down. The messages of hate that filled his inbox were louder than ever, but they were not the only voices he heard. Among the threats, there were also voices of support. People who were thanking him for speaking out, for bringing attention to the truth that so many had ignored for so long. Strangers who shared their own painful experiences of racism and inequality, who expressed their gratitude for him using his platform to give a voice to the voiceless. It was these messages, these words of encouragement, that slowly started to mend the cracks in his resolve. The fight, as difficult as it was not his alone. It was bigger than him now. It was about something far more important than his own comfort or safety. He thought of the man he had seen being beaten on the street, the pain in his eyes as he lay on the ground, broken and discarded. Ethan could still hear the cries of helplessness in his mind. The man was no different from the countless others who had suffered under the weight of racism, injustice, and apathy. They were all fighting for the same thing: to be seen, to be heard, and to have their pain acknowledged. And Ethan, for the first time in his life, realized that he could be part of that fight. But then, late one night, the darkness closed in again. Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message, one that made his blood run cold. "We're coming for you. Stop this now, or you'll regret it." His heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but it felt like a threat of something far worse than just words. It was a warning, one he couldn't ignore. The fear crept back into his chest, cold and suffocating. His palms began to sweat as he stared at the message, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was it a joke? Or were they serious? Were they really coming for him? The question echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, pounding louder and louder until it filled his head. For a moment, Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts spinning wildly in every direction. What if they were right? What if he had made a mistake? What if this was all too much, too dangerous? He stood up, pacing back and forth in his apartment, his heart hammering in his chest. The weight of everything, the threats, the isolation, the fear, felt almost too much to bear. The walls seemed to close in around him. He was exhausted, drained in a way he hadn't known was possible. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself, and for a moment, he thought about pulling the post down, about walking away from it all and pretending it hadn't happened. It would be so easy to do that, to retreat into silence, to let the world go back to its comfortable state of ignorance. But then, he stopped. The words of the victim he had seen that night flashed in his mind, the pleading look in his eyes. He remembered the stories people had shared with him, the voices that had spoken out in support. These were the voices that mattered. These were the voices that would never be silenced. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized something important. He had made a choice, and he wasn't going to back down now. Not when the stakes were so high. With a deep, steadying breath, Ethan put his phone down. His heart was still racing, his hands still trembling, but something inside him had shifted. He couldn't go back. He couldn't let fear control him any longer. This fight was bigger than him, bigger than the threats or the isolation. This was about truth. This was about justice. This was about creating a world where no one else had to suffer in silence. Ethan wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every voice that had been crushed beneath the weight of systemic oppression. And as he sat back down at his desk, his fingers already moving over the keyboard, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. As the weeks stretched on, the pressure on Ethan only intensified. It seemed like every moment of his life was consumed by the noise, the constant barrage of hate messages, the whispers behind his back, and the overwhelming sense that he was walking a tightrope, constantly on the edge of falling. His inbox was a never-ending flood of messages. Some were vicious, threatening his safety and career; others were dismissive, telling him to stop stirring up trouble; and a few, a small handful, offered support, reassuring him that his voice mattered. It was these rare messages of solidarity that kept him going when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. But they were few, and the threats were loud, and they weighed heavily on him. Every day, Ethan found himself waking up with a pit in his stomach, dreading the incoming onslaught of emails and texts. His phone never stopped buzzing, and the fear he had felt when the first wave of messages started pouring in was now a constant companion. At first, he had been filled with a sense of righteousness, convinced that he was doing the right thing, but as time wore on, the isolation set in. The people he had once been close to seemed to withdraw, their silence louder than the angry words of his critics. Even his friends, the ones who had always been supportive, seemed to shy away from him, as if his fight was one that was too dangerous, too controversial to be associated with. He felt as though he had been cast adrift, stranded on an island of his own making, with no way to reach anyone on the shore. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Ethan found himself pacing his small apartment at night, his thoughts racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never imagined that speaking out would cost him so much: his sense of safety, his peace of mind, and, it seemed, his place in the world. The constant barrage of threats, both anonymous and from people he knew, left him questioning whether the fight was worth it. There were nights when the fear gnawed at him, making it hard to breathe, wondering if he was putting his life at risk, wondering if this was how it felt to be completely alone in the fight for something bigger than oneself. But then, amid the uncertainty and the fear, there were moments when the weight of the fight felt lighter. They were fleeting moments, brief flashes of clarity, when Ethan realized that despite everything, the threats, the isolation, the doubt, he was doing something that mattered. He thought back to the reason he had written the article in the first place. It wasn't just for him. It was for the victims of injustice, for the voices that had been silenced for too long. As the days passed, the threats kept coming, but they no longer held the same power over him. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but now it was more like a distant echo, no longer the suffocating force it once was. He had found something more powerful than fear: purpose. Then, one afternoon, when Ethan was at his favorite cafe, trying to focus on a new project, he received a message that stopped him in his tracks. It was from a woman he didn't know, her name unfamiliar. As he read her words, his breath caught in his throat. The message was short but simple: "You don't know me, but your post saved my son." He was on the verge of giving up, thinking that no one cared. Your words gave him hope. The weight of the message hit Ethan like a wave, and for the first time in weeks, tears pricked at the back of his eyes. In that moment, all the threats, the isolation, the fear, and the doubt seemed to vanish. It was as though the universe had given him a sign, a small but powerful reminder that what he was doing mattered. His words had made a difference. They had reached someone, saved someone. And that, in the end, was why he had kept going. The feeling lingered long after he put his phone down. He was no longer just a writer caught in the crossfire of a heated debate. He was part of something much bigger, something that had the potential to change the world. The threats still came, and the fear still crept in, but they no longer defined him. Every day, as the fight continued, Ethan felt more certain of his place in it. He thought of all the people who had written to him, sharing their own stories of discrimination, of suffering, of being ignored. Their voices, once drowned out by the weight of society's indifference, were now coming together, forming a chorus that couldn't be silenced. With each passing day, Ethan grew more determined to keep pushing forward. It wasn't easy. It wasn't without fear. But the knowledge that his words had made a difference, that they had sparked something in others, kept him going. His journey was far from over, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but now he was no longer afraid of the challenges he faced. Because, in the end, the fight wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been left behind, everyone who had been told their voice didn't matter. And Ethan knew now, without a doubt, that his voice would never be silenced again.